Good evening, Columbus community. I'm President Jennifer Adair of the Columbus Board of Education, and I would like to call this meeting of the Board of Education to order on May 28th, 2020. Mr. Treasurer, will you please call the roll?
President Adair.
Present.
Ms. Beckerly.
Present.
Mr. Brown.
I'm here.
Cole.
I'm President Jennifer Adair of the Board of Education to order on.
Dr. Pierce.
Present.
Mr. Ragland.
Here.
Vice President Reyes.
She is excused.
You have a quorum, Madam President.
Thank you so much. Board members, you have the agenda in front of you this evening. We will have some public comment on specific items of our agenda, and then we have some human resource actions, and then we will move into what the bulk of this meeting will be about, into a board retreat, which will be facilitated by Dr. Roseanne Stripling around the Phi Delta Kappa curriculum audit, and then we will adjourn. Are there any questions about our agenda this evening? Seeing none, is there a motion to approve the agenda?
I'm motion to approve the agenda for this evening.
Second.
Thank you. Mr. Treasurer, please call the roll.
President Adair.
Yes.
Ms. Beckerly.
Yes.
Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown.
Yes.
There we go. Mr. Cole.
Yes.
Dr. Pierce.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Ragland.
Yes.
That motion carried.
Thank you so much. We will now move into public comment. This evening, because we needed to do some human resource actions prior to a June 1st cutoff, we have incorporated these actions into this special board meeting. And typically in a regular board meeting, we would have public comment on them. And so that is why we're accepting public comment only on items 4.1 and 4.2 of this agenda this evening. So I do know we have 3 individuals who have signed up for public comment. This evening's public comment, participants have 2 minutes to address the Board of Education. And Board Liaison Misty Nichols will, oh, she's already on, show her screen. And we will have our first speaker, Amanda Eakins. Topic, support for Summer Anthony, board action. She would like the Board of Education to renew the contract for Summer Anthony.
President Adair, the first speaker is on the line. Ms. Eakins, you have 2 minutes. Go ahead and begin.
Okay. Hi, I am an intervention specialist. I teach students with multiple disabilities, and I have been teaching at Como for 11 years. I have served on the building leadership team and the student support team for the past 5 years. I would like to talk about some of the really great things that have happened under the leadership of Mrs. Anthony. We have added 2 special ed units under Mrs. Anthony, bringing our total to 6 special ed classes, 4 MD and 2 ED classes. Mrs. Anthony has helped foster a welcoming and inclusive environment for our special ed students. She has been an advocate for us and has worked to help us ensure that even our most challenging students have access to their least restrictive educational environment and reach their potential. Last year, our special ed classes were able to supersede our gap closure. Under Mrs. Anthony, we have developed and successfully implemented an amazing building-wide PBIS strategy that has earned us a recognition award this year. Building morale is up and we are working well as a team. Lastly, during this time of uncertainty, Mrs. Anthony has been the person that parents, students, and teachers have looked to for guidance and support. It would be in Como's best interest as a community to have Mrs. Anthony continue as principal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Eakin. Are there any clarifying questions from the Board of Education? There are no questions. Thank you so much for your public comment this evening. The next speaker is Sandra M. Bopp. Topic, support for Summer Anthony, board action. She would like the Board of Education to renew the contract for Summer Anthony. Miss Nichols is just getting her on the phone right now. I think I went a little too fast for her to dial that number, so we'll just give it a second.
President Adair, the second speaker is now on the line. Ms. Bob, you have 2 minutes. Go ahead and begin.
Madam President, Dr. Dixon, and board members, I'm here this afternoon to speak on behalf of Summer Anthony. I'm a teacher at Columbus City Schools for 25 years, in which 3 years have been at Como Elementary. I've known Summer personally and professionally for over 12 years. I'm here to speak about Summer's character. She's a woman of solid core beliefs and values. She stands up for what is right and knows who she is. She is a proud product of Columbus City Schools. She was a graduate at South High, and then she became a teacher and administrator working for CCS for 20 years. She's a diligent worker on behalf of all the students. She's often saying, I am here to do what is best for kids. And what is best for kids? Removing a principal who changed the school atmosphere? No, I would think not. Kids need a principal who's working on their behalf, one who collaborates with parents, teachers, and community. And that is just what Summer does. She leads collaboratively. She has the personality of wanting to gather multiple perspectives and learn to do more while thinking outside of the box. A person who thinks outside of the box is an innovative leader who develops new ideas and willing to take the risk for what they believe. Summer believes in her staff and her students. She's dedicated and available when they need her. That shows loyalty. Not only am I speaking on Summer's behalf as my administrator, but also as a loyal friend. I hope the board will reconsider the resolution of non-renewing Summer Anthony and allow her to remain in an administrative position at Como Elementary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bob. Are there any questions from the members of the board? Seeing none, we thank you so much for your public comment.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Brianna Miller, second grade teacher at Como. Topic, support for Summer Anthony, board action. She would like the Board of Education to renew the contract for Summer Anthony. And we will wait for Board Liaison Nichols to join us back when she has Ms. Miller on the line.
President Adair, the last speaker is on the line. Ms. Miller, you have 2 minutes. Go ahead and begin.
Good evening, board members and Dr. Dixon. Thank you for allowing me to speak tonight in support of Summer Anthony. Last week, I sent an email to the board and Dr. Dixon in support of Ms. Anthony. I highlighted many positive changes that have been made at Como during my 4 years as a teacher. I could continue to list more reasons and wonderful changes that have happened at Como under the leadership of Ms. Anthony, but I only have 2 minutes and it would not be enough time to make it through half of my list. Instead, I will try to help you see Summer Anthony the way her staff sees her. Ms. Anthony is a relationship builder. It has been her goal to create a positive and supportive community for the staff, students, and families of Como. She has worked hard to create trust between staff, students, and families, seeing the value that it would bring to all involved with Como. We have had hard times of uncertainty, and moments of uncomfortableness, but through it all, Ms. Anthony has given us her support, her attention, and her willingness to change with us. She has grown and matured as a leader of our school, continuously moving forward in her actions and decisions as principal. Ms. Anthony is a visionary. We support Ms. Anthony because we believe in her vision for Como. There is still a lot of work that needs to be done, but we know that Ms. Anthony will be next to us, putting in the hard work to get our vision accomplished. Ms. Anthony is also a hard worker. Expects her staff to put in work that she herself will not do. She encourages us and sets the example. We know that we can count on her to labor alongside with us, and that expectations won't be placed upon us that she herself isn't willing to do first. Being a hard worker is not a quality easily found anymore. When you have it, the goal should be to keep it and support it so that it continues to grow and help others. As I conclude, I ask the board members to reconsider their position on non-renewing Ms. Anthony, to let go of any misconceptions you might have, and to look objectively at the case. I know it's easy to look at one negative and create an idea or reputation, but one negative does not negate the 99 positives. We as staff know the faults of our leader, but her transparency with them and her continual reflection, growth, and changing allow us to pass those faults and truly see her for who she is, a supportive, caring, and driven leader, one we are proud to stand behind and support. We ask that you please reconsider your position. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Are there any questions from the Board of Education? Seeing no questions, we thank you so much for your public comment.
Thank you.
That now concludes the public comment portion of the meeting. We will now move into item 4 under Human Resources. The first item on the agenda is 4.1, resolution to non-renew the administrator contract of Summer Anthony and to authorize the treasurer to furnish written notice of the intention of the Board of Education to not reemploy Summer Anthony. Is there a motion to adopt the resolution? And I believe Board Member Cole, you
Yes.
might have it.
Yes, Madam President. I'm introducing this motion to not renew the administrative contract of Summer Anthony and to authorize the treasurer to furnish written notice of the intention of the Board of Education to not reemploy Summer Anthony. Be it resolved by the Columbus City School Board District of Education that the board does not intend to reemploy Summer Anthony as an administrator at the expiration of her contract, and as a result, her contract of employment is non-renewed. Be it further resolved that the treasurer is authorized and directed to sign written notice of this resolution and to give Summer Anthony a copy of said notice on or before June 1st, 2020. Madam President.
Is there a second?
Second.
Is there discussion? Seeing none, Mr. Treasurer, please call the roll.
Ms. Beckerly,
Yes.
Mr. Brown,
Yes.
Mr. Cole,
No.
Dr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Ragland,
No.
President Adair.
Yes.
That motion carried.
Thank you so much. We will now move to item 4.2, resolution to non-renew the administrator contract of Deacon Hooper and to authorize the treasurer to furnish written notice of the intention of the Board of Education to not reemploy Deacon Hooper. Is there a motion to approve the resolution?
Yes, Madam President. Be it resolved by the Columbus City School District Board of Education that the board does not intend to reemploy Deacon Hooper as an administrator at the expiration of his contract. And as a result, his contract of employment is non-renewed. Be it further resolved that the treasurer is authorized and directed to sign written notice of this resolution and to give Deacon Hooper a copy of said notice on or before June 1st, 2020.
Is there a second?
Second.
Is there discussion? Seeing none, Mr. Treasurer, please call the roll.
Mr. Brown,
Yes.
Mr. Cole,
I abstain.
Dr. Pierce,
I abstain.
Mr. Ragland,
No.
President Adair,
Yes.
Ms. Beckerly,
Yes.
I wasn't prepared for that. So is Eric Roush on the line?
I'm here, Stan.
You have 3 aye, 2 abstain, 1 no. 1 absent.
Take a brief minute. I want to take a look at. I need to take a look at the bylaws here on this to see what exactly it says on this particular vote. We got to take a look at that. Madam President, could we have a brief recess? I think we need to get Mr. Barnes. I have a question from Mr. Barnes here as well.
Or
Um,
can we do?
Can Scott Wortman take several of us into a separate online room for a minute?
Yes, Dan, I can do that. I just need to know who.
Get James, me, and Eric Roush, please.
Okay.
We will. Thank you. We are back from recess. Mr. Treasurer?
Madam President, my apologies for the delay. Motion 4.02 fails.
Okay, thank you very much. We will move on with the agenda. Okay, I will ask at this point as we go into item 5 that anyone who is a guest now that will be participating in the board retreat facilitated by Dr. Stripling about the PDK audit, please go ahead and turn your cameras on as a guest. And as we get ready to turn it over to her, I just want to make a few comments. We are all in this together, and this is the time where we now take the what and figure out what to do with it. It's important that in these discussions and how we move forward, that we remain grown-ups and remain focused on question 0, which is our children at all times. It's going to take all of us to get through this, and it's going to take a while to get through it. We will not be doing any of this overnight. The PDK audit and the results are something that the administration will do a lot of in its strategic planning going forward. And as we walk through this discussion tonight, we will also define what the board responsibilities will be and the administration's responsibilities will be, and how we will work together and in conjunction with other pieces of our strategic plan that is going forward. So with tonight's discussion, we will be led through each of the recommendations. We will talk through each one individually. We will talk about prioritization of them and what we want to do. And we will leave with next steps. And we will have clear understanding of whose role is to be what, or what the next steps will be. Like I said, this is the first of many meetings and much discussion. So I want to thank everyone who is involved tonight, and especially Dr. Stripling, who has agreed to stay with us through the course of this and help us really achieve our best for our students. So I want to welcome the guests who are here right now. I see we have President of the CEA, Mr. Coniglio, and we may have others from staff that will pop in and out as needed. So Dr. Stripling, I will turn it over to you to begin leading us through the discussion.
Well, thank you, President, and hello, everyone. It's good to be back. The purpose of tonight's board workshop, which is typically a little more informal than a board meeting, is to continue the discussion we started several weeks ago. As you recall, we took several hours to discuss the 17 recommendations of the curriculum management audit. And that, as President Adair said, that's pretty much the so what. We talked a little bit at the very end of the session about, okay, so what? Now what are we going to do? And as I don't think Tracy is with us. Tracy, I've given you credit for this all along, but Tracy said, when the administrator, she said, oh, we need to add another issue, a third iteration of that, and that is, this is what we're going to do, which communicates a very proactive and aggressive effort to now take action. So tonight we're going to talk more in depth, or discuss more in depth, the 7 recommendations related to those 17 findings. And if you have a copy of the entire audit report, you might look on page 12. There's a matrix there. You know, we talked about the fact that we have 17 findings, but we don't have 17 recommendations, because what the auditors try to do is compile the effort so that we don't have 17 little silos of people working on the 17 findings. So if you want to follow along with regard to what recommendation matches what finding, you can find that on page 12. One more comment, and this is really just a reflection on what President Adair said. This is primarily a discussion. You know, this is not posted for board action, so the board's not expected, nor is it desirable that the board would take action on any of this tonight. But in early conversations with Dr. Dixon, it became very clear to me she wants to know the board's thoughts on this and what your thinking is. As Jennifer said, we're in this together. You're in this together. So before she finalizes her plans in terms of the administrative action, she wanted this discussion, this broad-based and more informal discussion about the recommendations. It's important that the board, number one, understand what the administration is going to be doing. And just as important, the board needs to support what's going to be going on behind the scenes. So you can support it internally as well as externally with your constituency. Because people are going to be asking you about what's going on with this audit, and you can speak with knowledge and support. So with that said, I'd like to start, as the board president said, and we're going to begin on page 321, and I'm putting my glasses on. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation tonight because we're going to get a little more in the details. However, I can't go over every step in these recommendations or we'd be here until midnight. So I picked out a few, and I might be a little slower on the uptake on some because I've written on my recommendations the points I want to make. So let's get started. I'm going to put my glasses on so I can read, and I apologize for the glare, the reflection in the glare. So on page 321, the recommendations begin. And you see that those first 4 or 5 paragraphs are just kind of an intro. And again, this is going to be pretty short, pretty quick reading, even though it's pretty detailed. I highly recommend, if you haven't read all of the recommendation section already, that you do so. But we'll start with recommendation number 1, and you won't be surprised to know. Oh, let me say this. Remember that we said the recommendations, the findings fall are nested under the 5 standards, and we won't review those right now, but the recommendations are presented in the order that the auditors felt the degree of urgency to get started. Now, clearly, I hope, and I think it's the plan of the district, the administration, to start on all the recommendations with the exception of number 7, and I'll talk a little bit about that. You can't start on that yet because you don't have the underpinning, the foundation to work on programmatic budgeting yet. But ideally, you'll be working on all the first 6 of these recommendations at the same time. As we talked in our pre-meeting earlier, and I think Dr. Dixon and I have talked about this too, I'm recommending that there be a lead person for each of the recommendations, and in some cases, because the recommendations might be a little more complex than others, there may be a couple of lead people involved in carrying this work forward. And those people will be reporting, I understand, to Monique. So recommendation number 1, as you won't be surprised, is all about control. How the board needs to establish its control over the district's personnel, over their programs, over everything that goes on in the district. So recommendation, I'm not going to read this one to you. Sometimes I may read them, but this recommendation addresses board policies, getting board policies in place, directing the superintendent to get administrative guidelines in place to shore up the policies, add a little more detail. You know, policies don't go into a whole lot of detail. They just express the board's expectations somewhat in general terms. And then administrative guidelines follow up with more detail. So both of those are important. And as we said before, usually several of your board policies require administrative guidelines that we didn't find. So those should be accomplished first. But then it's the superintendent's prerogative to write administrative guidelines for other policies, and especially those policies that are pretty complex and that are very critical to the ongoing success of the district, and any policy that might be a little misunderstood. That's what administrative guideline, one of the things administrative guidelines does, and that's be sure that people understand what that policy requires, so there's no misunderstanding, or at least to reduce the level of misunderstanding. So recommendation number 1 addresses policies, administrative guidelines, planning. You're going to hear a lot about planning. In fact, planning permeates the entire audit, as you recall, and we'll be addressing some of those. It also addresses this, recommendation number 1, addresses the people, one of the most expensive item in your budget on a basis. The people on the bus and the seats they are sitting in. We'll look at job descriptions as well as the administrative or organizational structure. So let's get started with number 1. And I want to talk with you a little bit about the format. When the recommendation finding or the recommendation heading or following the recommendation heading are a few paragraphs, and primarily those paragraphs before we get into the specific actions to be taken or recommendations to be taken. There's a statement of rationale, a paragraph of why this is important, like why board policies are important, why planning is important. And then there's a summary paragraph of what the auditors found. Again, just to kind of renew your memory, refresh your memory about what we found. And I won't spend a lot of time on what we found. In some cases, I might mention it, but that's not my intent. So if you flip to page 322, I'm turning the page now, those of you who want to follow me. I've divided, or the auditors divided this recommendation into the 3 sections then. The first section's on board policies and administrative guidelines. The second one's on planning. And the third one's on the table of organization and job descriptions. So G11, which means governance for recommendation, the first action item in recommendation 1 for the governance. So I want y'all, that's G11. That's all about developing a set of policies. As I said when we talked last time, your policies are legally compliant, but they stop short of providing the direction and control for quality curriculum management. And so we go into detail there about and those elements that need to be in this policy are in exhibits 1.13 through 1.17, so you can look back at that. Now, here's what you have. It's interesting that you do not have a policy, and I think all of these can be in one policy. So Eric, I don't know if Eric's still with us or not. I see he is. So I suggest, and this is just a recommendation, that you not go in and drop all of these, and I think there are about 26 elements that need to be in there, but into different policies, but you establish a new policy. And I would call that new policy needs to be in section 2000, and that you call it curriculum management. You have an administrative guideline that's called curriculum development. It's administrative. It's AG 2210A, if I can read my writing. But it stops short. It gets, and it's a great example of a guideline because it goes into more detail. But you do not have an overarching policy that addresses curriculum management. So that would be my recommendation, that somewhere and that you just create somewhere in the 2000 section, you create a new policy entitled curriculum management. I thought, well, it could be policy 2210, but that's not, you've got a policy 2210, but it's not about curriculum development or management. So, all right, so a set of policies, that's very important that you get started on that very quickly. And that will not only establish control, but it will communicate to people what the board's expectations are as related to this audit that talks about curriculum management. Then the second half of that first one is important too. Components related to supporting curriculum functions, though, like curriculum planning, assessment planning, drop those into, and you'll see more about these in those other recommendations, which drop those into the respective categories. I'm reading on the final line of G 1.1. They should be placed in respective categories, 0, 0, 0, 1,000, and so on. To reinforce, again, it doesn't hurt to reflect board expectations in more than one policy. But the core set of expectations for curriculum management can be, and I think should be, written into one new policy. I'm jumping on down on camera, and then obviously the number 2 or 1.2, you've already got a policy related to administrative guidelines. So Dr. Dixon understands that it's her responsibility now to get those administrative guidelines written. And Eric can help her identify which policies require administrative guidelines. And then, as I said, I hope that the district, as you go along in this process, will choose to write even more administrative guidelines. And I love the fact that Ohio and Texas was slow in getting there, but finally we did this too. Through your board association, y'all can link your administrative guidelines with your policies. When I was superintendent several years ago, TASB, our Texas Association, could not do that. So we had administrative guidelines floating around somewhere, and then the board policies were online. So it's wonderful that all those can be collected together. So when someone's looking for guidance and direction on a particular issue, they don't have to skirt around all over several different places. They can go to that one site online and see what the policies say and what administrative guidelines say. G.1.3, I want to mention this, and it doesn't have to be, and I'm not sure if that acronym is pronounced NEOLA. Is that the way it's pronounced? Okay. The board should consider, and it could be through AJ, another consultant who's going to be working with you on the board, for the board, or really any knowledgeable group, just to have a working session. You've got several new board members about what the board's role. Here's the board's role, and here's the superintendent's role. And in doing that, you would ask those 4 questions, and I'm not going to go into this much detail on all of them, but you see in that G1.3. The conversation should be focused on 4 questions. I'm on the 5th line there. Number 1, do current board policies reflect all the board's collective expectations about curriculum management? Well, I think you're going to say no. You're going to take care of that. But what needs to be, what's not addressed? What directives or governance expectations are not being addressed by the board or the superintendent? In other words, what is vacant? What's missing? What is not being addressed at all? Then, very importantly, jumping on to the end of that, number 3, what responsibilities, if any, are being assumed by the board that should be handled by the superintendent? And then what responsibilities, if any, are being assumed by the superintendent that should require board approval? So that's, especially with new board members, I think it's very important to have that conversation just to renew everybody's understanding about governance and administrative roles. G1.4, and I'm spending a little more time on this than I will in the future, but in every one of these recommendations, there is a point there is a specific action recommended in which the superintendent would be reporting to the board. So the board needs to be sure, the board president needs to be sure that the superintendent understands that the board expects a report out on even administrative functions, how things are moving along. Number 1.5, we talked about this a little bit during our first session. I'm recommending, and I still recommend this, even though I want to talk with you a little bit about it, that the board and the superintendent have a conversation with the Columbus Education Association to address some of the issues, some of this, particularly the statement that I think portends. That's the one that says, let me go back let me finish my sentence. There's a statement at the beginning of the agreement that says that this agreement really supersedes any current or future board policies. I still think that concerns me, because I think that statement portends the potential of the board losing control through policies. Now, that said, President Ragland asked me at the end of our last session if I would review in detail the amendment. And I did, again, after shortly Monica sent it to me, and I read, I think, every page of it. And I've come to the conclusion that even though I'm concerned about this first statement, there's nothing, I don't believe, based on my interpretation, the current agreement does not prohibit or prevent the board from, number one, adopting policies that we're recommending, or the administration's following through with the recommendations. There are a couple of issues in the agreement that I think are of concern, and I think one of the ones we addressed is the fact that it appears, my interpretation, our interpretation, that the current wording in the agreement facilitates easy move or the transfer of a marginal teacher from one campus to another. That's my interpretation. But that said, I think, and I understand, I see the two representatives from the CAE are here. Although I still sit on that recommendation and think it's a good idea, I think it's probably not going to happen. That's a new agreement. It's in effect for 19 through 22. So that's for the board and the superintendent to decide. But after reviewing that, I did send back to Monica comments on certain parts of the agreement. But I read through it, and I think that the board can adopt the policies we've recommended, and the administration can move forward with the administrative recommendations. So now let's talk about administrative functions. So I won't spend that much time from now on the governance. But basically, board members, you're going to see there's repetition here. Your role in all 7 of these recommendations is, number one, get those policies in place. Number 2, ask for reports from the superintendent about administrative efforts to not just to implement the audit, but everything that the administration's doing. And number 3, to provide any financial support that's needed. And I don't think there are many of these. I'm trying to think, recommendations that require any additional financial support. But if they do during the course of the implementation of the audit recommendations, the board should consider any budgetary issues. And then number 4, and that's just to support the initiative of the audit in your community. So let's go on to administrative functions and kind of moving through this. Clearly, administrative guidelines, Dr. Dixon, that's going to be an important thing for you to take care of. On page 223 at the very top, when I visited with Eric during the on-site audit, I found out that the board does not have, or the administration, really this is an administrative issue, does not have a systematic way of communicating any new board policy revisions or any administrative guidelines. So I highly recommend, Dr. Dixon, that you and the staff of the administrative council talk about how, it may be Eric's response, maybe end up being his responsibility. And that's one of the reasons I think we found that people don't really rely much. They don't consider the policies and administrative guidelines to be the Bible, so to speak, of how this district's going to function. So more internal emphasis should be placed on board policy and administrative regs, and people need to understand where they can go to get to understand the direction of the board. So that's in 8.1.3. And then 1.4 is just related back to the training that I'm recommending. So now let's get into planning. again, usually the first thing is all about policy. You do not have a comprehensive policy on planning. Now, again, this is going to come out in the policy piece too, but I want to reemphasize it here. Most of your planning is addressed through PO 1230, which is responsibilities of the superintendent. You say it's the responsibility of the superintendent to plan, and that's good. And interestingly, in PO 2120, you talk about planning and school improvement, but it's kind of indirect. And what I'm recommending here is you come out with a new policy. You might just call it planning. Somewhere in section 1000, it needs to be an administration that talks about the expectations for planning. And again, it doesn't have to, and then there could be an administrative guideline that, and I'm going to jump to number 6, and from there to number 6. Let me see. No, I'm still in governance. Yeah, I'll talk about the administrative guidelines in 8.1.6. But establish a policy, a standalone policy, and call it planning. So you put focus on the planning process. And now I'm going to jump down. You can read the others of the other governance, but basically it's just asking this. I do want you to hold on G.1.7. That's requesting the superintendent prepare and present for board review and adoption of policy requiring performance-based budgeting development process. You can't do that. That's recommendation. That's recommendation number 7. And you can't do that yet because you don't have a program evaluation process in place. So now looking at it, so basically in terms of planning, get your policy in place and communicate the importance of planning as a means to get to where you want to be without too many detours. On administrative functions, again, other than helping the board with the policies, Dr. Dixon, your first guideline, your first order of business would be to develop some administrative guidelines. And we've listed the different kinds of planning and issues of planning and plans that we expect in the audit, and they're listed there at the bottom of 323. District-wide planning, we've already talked about that, and that could be addressed in the new policy, and then you could put a little more details in there in your administrative guideline. But you see comprehensive district-wide improvement plan. Again, we talked about what we found in the plans from when we met last time, that they are perceived mostly as compliance plans and not day-to-day guidance plans. Curriculum management plan, assessment management planning, professional development planning, program innovation, program evaluation planning, technology planning. You do have a technology plan. We'll talk a little more about that, but it lacks the comprehensiveness that it needs to have. All right, so I think you can see that. So administrative guidelines that support the policies on planning. So now if you will flip to page 324, let me see what I want to. A18 and A19 address evidence of planning. A19 actually recommends that you develop, whoever's going to be responsible for the different plans, develop a PERT chart to help move along. But what that does, that puts in concrete evidence of planning. We had a hard time finding evidence of planning because we didn't find minutes we found minutes of board meetings because they're legally required, but we couldn't find evidence of planning. I hope that makes sense to you, but we're looking for little vestiges of evidence. How does this district plan? So A18 and A19 address how you can, not that you're necessarily going to want to provide evidence for future auditors, but just so people will know and understand and communicate what's going on. A110. We never did get a clear understanding of whether or not anybody's responsible for planning. Anybody is kind of overarching to see what's going on in planning and plans. I know the area superintendent said that, we're responsible for campus plans. Well, I think I'll mention in a few minutes, the area superintendents have way too many things on their plate. Not that they couldn't get involved in plans, but I think, Dr. Dixon, you might consider just appointing someone, thinking about who can be responsible for ongoing, for managing, for systematically reviewing the planning process and plans. All right, so now that's planning. Let's go on to job descriptions and organizational charts. And again, it's so important that people are a district's, any institution that, so people intensive. People are your most valuable asset. Now, you've got a good policy. You've got policy 3120.01 job descriptions that says very clearly, this district shall have a job description for every person. However, we did not find that. You've got your policy in place, so you're kind of in good shape here in terms of policy. I talk a little bit at the end of 1.9. I get into a little more detail here, but I think your policy is in pretty good shape for job descriptions. But that second sentence under G.1.9 might really be more in administrative guidelines. Well, G.1.10 is important. When I talked to Myra is the chief administrator for human resources. She was upfront and she said, no one is responsible for job descriptions. And she was very aware that we found job descriptions for less than 50% of the positions that were on the organizational chart. So it's important that the district, you might include that in the policy. I think that's what I was addressing here. You don't have a policy on organizational chart, but you do give the superintendent authority to organize the district's administration. So I would say this, Dr. Dixon, I think it's important that your tables, that your organizational charts be on your website. For all, it's not just internal. A lot of people say, "Oh, well, but that should be internal." But it's important for the world to be able to see. In fact, your policy does say when the policy gives you authority to organize the administration. I think it does say that should be easily accessible to the public. So think about putting those on your website. So now again, we're in administrative functions at the very bottom of 124. And y'all will have a chance at the end of this recommendation, we'll have a chance to discuss it and y'all can ask for more clarification if you need it. So basically, 1.13 is let's do it. Let's follow the policy. Let's get those job descriptions done. And I think A114 gives you a little more detail about that. 115, and I think that's important. A lot of people say they had never seen their job description, so be sure, and that could be because there wasn't a job description for that position. But 1.15 just addresses the fact once you get those job descriptions in place, or if you revise a job description, I think it's a good idea every time the performance review occurs that the supervisor gives the person they're evaluating a copy of the job description. And ideally, everybody would sign off on that. Number 1.16, we found that, I said I wasn't going to go over the findings so much, but it's very important that that when you change a position title, that you get that title changed on job description, because we found a lot of inconsistencies between and among job titles on your table of organization and what people said their titles were and on job descriptions. So that's 16. Number 17 addresses the organization of people. And I know, again, that's the superintendent's role. We give some specific recommendations about how, again, this is not related to any one particular person, We're just looking at what appears to be the principles of sound organizational management. So take a look at the recommended table of organization, Dr. Dixon, how we recommend that functions be moved around. For example, I think it makes sense to me that the executive director of budgeting and financial management report to the treasurer. Again, these are recommendations. This is just what what based on what we can see and what we hear when we talk with people, that makes more sense and puts the district in a better position to manage the personnel. So you can see, and I think that recommended table of organization for the executive leadership team is in Appendix I, if you want to see that. Again, only recommendation. There's more than one way to skin a cat, but be sure that in your new structure that you follow the 6 principles of sound organizational management, and you'll see all of that detailed in I think that's finding 1.2. .19 at the bottom of the page. I recommend that, and Talisa, this would be your, Dr. Dixon, this would be your responsibility, or you can assign it, that there be a standard format for organizational charts. We looked at about 15 or 16, and they were all in a different chart. And you know that familiarity, it's so important for someone who's looking at a chart, looking at anything, whether it's a curriculum document or whatever, that there's that that the organization of the information is consistent. I think it facilitates understanding. So, all right, now I'm let's see, I'm still in. I've turned to 326. All right, I think those are the points I wanted to make in recommendation number 1. So, Board President, I think I'll stop now to see. You know, I know that the board was interested in talking about maybe some actions that had already been taken on each of the recommendations, or there may be some questions or some comments by people. So let me turn this back over to you.
Yes, thank you. So thank you for that. This recommendation certainly had a lot in it. So just to kind of highlight those 3 areas again for questioning. We have the policy part from the board, we have the planning piece, and then we have more of the superintendent's administrative job description, organizational charts. I do know before we get into questions, the superintendent actually had some items she wanted to share about things that we are already working on in these. But I also wanted to say just a quick comment about the collective bargaining, since you did bring that up. So, you know, we sit down at the table, we bargain it, we come to an agreement, and that certainly is not something that is going to open up as a result of this, this audit. And so I'm pretty confident that our partners at CA can and will, John, if you want to come back on, I know you're here, will work with us on, you know, implementing and doing what we need to do on behalf of our kids. So just to kind of put that out there, it's not an opportunity to reopen that negotiation, and that's not the intent at all.
And I think that's fine. As I said, and in the spirit of goodwill, I think everybody, we're all focusing on the same thing. We all want what's best for the students, and as long as we all keep that in mind, again, my main concern was that statement. But as I looked through it, all the recommendations, you know, we're recommending some new assessments come into place, but those are not standardized assessments. So that's just an example. And Monica has a copy of my comments on each on that document if anyone wants to see that. So I think that we're good to go. I think that's fine.
Great. So Dr. Dixon, I'm going to turn it back to you before we have comments. You can kind of share some things we've already, or you've already been doing around this recommendation.
Oh, so thank you, Board President Adair. I just wanted to just say as a reminder that I believed it was so important for us to conduct this assessment to allow for an understanding of what is happening in our schools and in our classrooms across the district. The audit, as Dr. Stripling has pointed out, covered more than just the taught curriculum. It also evaluated our operations and governance and how each supports teaching and learning in the classroom. The audit also showed that there's great work happening in a number of areas, and there were areas for improvement, but there was some great work that was being done. So I want Dr. Tracy Ocasio just to highlight some of the great things that the team has been working on. So remember, Dr. Tracy Ocasio is our Chief Academic Officer, and she has led a lot of the work that's been happening in academic services. She identified a lot of these items too once she began in the district, and just really galvanized the academic services team with teachers and administrators, and some great work has been done. So Dr. Ocasio, if you would just share just a few highlights regarding recommendation under one, or just some of the highlights that we have already seen in the district.
So under recommendation 1, we did look at structures within the curriculum office. We made some transitions in terms of the organization. A lot of what we did was under recommendation 2, which I believe that Dr. Stripling is going to move forward with. And so a lot of that revolves around us adopting a robust MTSS framework, because all of the curriculum pieces that many of these recommendation items are related to come into this MTSS framework. And so the team spent a lot of time working with design teams that included administrators, included some of our union leadership, included many of our teachers from various grade levels, various areas, and also from various experiences. So we had some newer teachers, we had some more senior teachers. What we started with was this MTSS framework, and that articulated the key components, which is about assessment, it's about instructional vision, what does it look like to have effective instruction in the district, the interventions that we might provide for students, and the professional development. And I'm really excited. We're finishing up on a 3-year professional development plan that starts next year. And so we are looking at, what do teachers need? What do school counselors need? And it's by focused audience. Instructional assistants are in that focus group. Administrators also have a plan. And this is a 3-year plan to go deeper. And this is multiple audiences, social workers, anything that you'd see in academic services, nurses. So it's very diverse. And each of these are by targeted audience, with next year being very fully sketched out. And then articulated out what happens in year 2 and 3. So part of this, we also adopted curriculum this year. As many of you are aware, we brought a lot of this to the board. We have new ELA curriculum, K to 12. We have new math resources curriculum, K to 12. And we are identified this process finished May 2020. And so part of this professional development is talking about not only going deeper with, here are your resources, but our biggest focus next year in terms of instruction is, here's the standard, here's the depth of knowledge, how do we extend learning and get kids to learn in that design thinking phase, that extending their content knowledge, extending across areas. So we'll see a lot of that coming through next year, and that's also part of MTSS. We are looking at tailoring up our interventions. That's going to be a big focus next year, is looking at what happens in tier 2 and 3. We have started to shift the focus when we identified effective instructional pillars and what's important for an effective lesson delivery, what's important for effective lesson planning, how do we create a conducive environment for learning, how do we use our assessment. Those are our 4 pillars that we're working from. But we also talked about intervention begins at the core level, so that teachers monitor for the standards aligned outcome, that exemplar, and they adjust their instruction. So that's a big part of the work that we've done this year. We've created decision-making trees that actually the state representatives that have come in have asked us for our information and have used. I'm sorry, for a moment, I think I went out. The state representatives have taken our decision-making trees. They're in ELA and also in math. And so we're using them with teachers to talk about what's the tailored intervention, so that teachers are able to look at their assessment data, talk about what it says, and then how do I help students and I intervene on that particular area that might be a gap skill or that might be an area of learning. We've adopted foundations. We've seen through our data that our students are not getting those letter sound connections, and that those are the most basic, but then their foundational standards as they go through the elementary are not being strong, and they're not demonstrating mastery of those. So we've looked at our foundations program, and we've moved that down into our early childhood program as well. We have looked at special education. We are looking at what's a great emotional support program as opposed to a great multi-disabilities program, and looking at ways that we can serve students not only with complex needs, but also those in those higher incidence categories like learning support. Part of this is going to be focused and woven into our professional development and really looking at the depth of knowledge. How do I have students perform at these higher levels of thinking, which was something we found in the audit as well. One of the things that we're doing is we've articulated a framework for the instructional block by grade level and content area. We've developed a framework for professional development that has a sequence and a scope and sequence for staff development. We've identified not only these instructional pillars, but we've aligned them then to the evaluation model through OTES. We have now gone back based on what has happened with the current health crisis and talked about this is a traditional classroom setting, here is a virtual classroom setting, and here's any hybrid. And so talked about these are the effective pillars. Here's what it would look like if I were face-to-face with students, but not just face-to-face, but with technology integrated. And all of our new adoptions, including those to support gifted learners, we have some new curriculum there. We have some new language acquisition curriculum. All of these have an electronic component, an online opportunity, knowing that we may need this moving forward. We have developed a virtual learning plan within the 2 weeks of the closure that incorporated platforms from early childhood through grade 12. We're going back with a team that's actually looking at those platforms. These things were adopted very quickly and based on what was available to us and not having to go through the RFP process. And so we had to look at what the district already had. Now we're looking at how do I not only look at what we have, but how do I make sure it's good quality and that it's getting to the standards aligned outcomes? So we're going back and refining that. We're also talking about the ways to use our new platform with Canvas. That is a learning management system. It's also an assessment management system that offers the opportunity not only to deliver instruction, deliver professional development, but it warehouses all of our curriculum resources and makes them easily accessible to teachers. And that was a key finding as well. Our curriculum documents lived everywhere. We looked at our gifted model to assure that we had equitable access. We looked at the model for serving English language learners. And so we looked at how we could fortify our English language acquisition curriculum to build that proficiency much more quickly than we had seen in our data in the past. We've begun developing a comprehensive assessment plan that incorporates short cycle assessments, lesson exemplars, progress monitoring opportunities, as well as universal screeners, not only for academics, but also for behavior. We're developing that scope and sequence with a tie to social and emotional learning competencies. I mentioned that we have this system for learning management that we have adopted, which is Canvas. It's not only the repository, but it also offers an assessment system. It offers us the opportunity to develop blueprint courses, as well as to extend blended learning across the district and to extend our options. So if there are students that want certain courses and there aren't enough students in the building, we can actually extend the parameters of that high school campus and do an open campus course using this new model. And we have a very tailored integration model for this new option here, this learning management system that starts off with what people actually need to know to be able to access information, but then also moves more deeply in how can I use this to promote learning? And we have some focused areas as well. We're going to start with the high school level for a deeper implementation of that learning management system and then move that down through early adopters as well as the other levels. We have developed a high school course guide that actually is by career strand that's been adopted through the Ohio Department of Ed. And so those career strand, as you mentioned, or as you may have remembered, back in the winter, we had shared that it talks about what I would need if I wanted to have post-secondary education at various levels, including the doctoral level. Based on the area of study, we have worked with we have developed a school counseling curriculum that helps students get early access. One of the pieces of feedback is that our middle school students need to be exposed to so that they can select these pathways that they believe will work for them. And so we've had that opportunity to work those course guides backwards into middle school, and then also look at what does that mean for our counseling oriented sessions with students that would be delivered by school counselors. The other piece of that is we are working on redeveloping some of our CTE programs. We have a grant for planning that it will be announced shortly. The other aspects related to that grant with one of our local businesses, and we are looking at career opportunities. We are now working with career advisory groups to talk about what are experiences that we should weave into this high school course guide to assure that students have those successful experiences. We actually have pathways within those course guides so that our kids can reach dual enrollment and AP courses. We have a very tailored approach that's very traditional in terms of the course sequence. We also have a very targeted approach for students that have struggled. And then we have an accelerated approach for students that decide they want higher levels of math or other types of higher levels of learning in English language arts based on their post-secondary goals. The other thing that we were able to do this year, and unfortunately given the circumstance, we had a very robust, very exciting targeted summer school experience that offered both intervention and enrichment. It also offered the opportunity to design thinking. What we're doing is now taking that experience virtual, and we're doing some project-based learning. We're looking at the types of things that kids would be exposed to during that time. We have some virtual camps for middle schoolers that are related to career and technical education, as well as some experiences at the high school level where students can get acceleration. 8th graders can take up to 2 high school courses during this time. And then our high school students can either accelerate or make up learning experiences that they may have missed or want to get a do-over, so to speak. The other thing is we looked at recommendation 3 and the way things are delivered in the classroom, the instruction that's delivered there. So we've connected that by the targeted audience professional development plans that are for a 3-year period. We also looked at what our targets are in terms of student outcomes. We looked at a regression where we've looked at performance over time, and now we know where we are predicted to be in the year 2025. And then we are working on having ambitious targets for 2025, weaving that back into a 3-year mark, and then also for a 1-year out mark. And so we've connected all of this to, again, our MTSS robust framework. We're working on data dialogues. We've collaborated with the accountability team to talk about tertiary data analysis that gets to the root cause. The last piece that I will share is that we now have a common framework, a common instructional framework that's anchored to that robust MTSS framework. And we have evidence of implementation that's been articulated so that it helps us as a team look at what's happening trend-wise across classrooms and then tailoring our professional development, especially as we're moving into some uncharted territory where we may have more technology integration, we may have blended formats, and looking at ways that we can support teachers by doing those with those look-fors. And so most of what you'll see is a lot of this is connected to, or almost all of it's connected to our MTSS framework, but we've looked at the various nuances that come into or that comprise a robust MTSS framework.
So thank you, Dr. Casio. I know that was a lot to digest, team members, and Dr. Casio talks so fast, but she has been leading so many efforts in academic services. I know she's so excited to be able to get all of those pieces in, but I just wanted her just to share that although, as I stated earlier, that the audit revealed a lot of things that we have to do to move forward, there have been so many great things that we've been able to do to date. So I wanted just to spend some time to highlight those things so that you know that, yes, there's a lot of work. Oh my gosh, this audit revealed all these things we have to work on, but it's not all doom and gloom. And the things that we have to put in place is going to help us run this organization better. Remember, it's a curriculum management audit, and it is looking at not only the curriculum, but also how the organization is operating. And I'm just excited about the work that has been done, the work that we have to look forward to, and just wanted her to spend a few minutes highlighting those things for you. So thank you, Dr. Casio, and back to you, Dr. Stripling.
Actually, it's going to go back to me.
Back to you, President Adair.
Well, we have some questions now about recommendation 1, and we're going to go to Dr. Pierce.
So thank you, everyone, for these great presentations, really focusing us on the work that needs to be done to continue to move our district forward, and most importantly, ensure that our students are learning. Dr. Ocasio's report really gave an extensive, I think, outline, overview of your current efforts to revamp and improve our curriculum. What's interesting to me is this work that needs to be done around silos. Has your team thought about how we will move forward to address this recommendation? In specific, how will we jointly come together with administration, with our board, and with the community to really design curriculum and align it with our vision and mission? I don't know if that question is for Dr. Dixon, Dr. Ocasio, whoever would like to step in and answer it.
Well, the questions were to be directed to Dr. Striplin, actually. So
Dr. Striplin, do you have some ideas or suggestions around that?
Well, I do think it's important to, to involve your external. First of all, I think it's your comment about silos. That's one of the reasons the recommendation should not be implemented in silos. That's why we collapse all of the issues involving control, for example, in one recommendation. And hopefully, as Dr. Dixon, as y'all get into this, and the board president, because recommendation number one is much about governance and administration and how they work together, but the board's getting things in control. So I think the silo issue is a point well taken, but I think the recommendations will eliminate, maybe not eliminate, but will address the silo issue. On the point related to how you're going to get into curriculum, I think we need to remember, I think the community needs to know what's going on, but the community is not composed of educators. And y'all are really the ones who know about curriculum. I'm have pretty specific feelings about who should be writing curriculum. Clearly, and I heard we're going to get into recommendation 2 in just a minute. That's all about curriculum management planning and curriculum development and revision. And it sounds like the district already has a curriculum framework. That's, Tracy, you have taken the ball and run with it. Remember when you told me, well, here's what we're going to do? Well, I think you've done that. But I'm not sure that to what degree the community needs to be involved deeply in the development of curriculum. Y'all have the Ohio standards. Clearly that needs to drive your objectives. And that's the linchpin, so to speak, of curriculum, even though it involves a lot of other things. So, I don't know that there is a particular response to that. And there were several issues in your questions, or several components of your questions, but I think you just continue to work collaboratively and take input. But in the end, though, the superintendent has to make a call on administrative functions, and the board has to make a call on governance functions. And the board should, the audit expectation is that the board approves curriculum. So I may have talked around, but but the issue.
So the reason I asked that question is because one of the things, and I brought this up with you on 2 different occasions, is ensuring that our curriculum is culturally relevant and culturally responsive. So that is why community needs to be at the table to ensure that the rich cultures and diversity are represented, not just in the images and on the walls throughout our buildings, but also in the curriculum, the books that our students are reading, the scholars that our students are educated on. So it's very important that we are aware of the value that our community brings to the table. We have a number of scholars and educators in our Columbus communities, both with degrees and without. So with academic and street smarts, and we want to bring that to bear on the education of our children. My second question then to you, Dr. Stripley, is, so upon reading this recommendation, I started doing some research and came across Align the Design. It was published in 2008, but it kind of lays out a way for boards and administrations to start to work together collaboratively with the community to design curriculum. Do you think that's a good starting point? Would you recommend that? If you're unfamiliar with it, could you check it out and let us know if that would be a good starting point?
Design, align, or align design?
Align the Design.
Align the Design. Okay, I'm not familiar with it. I certainly will check it out, but I think you make a good point on the culturally responsiveness. And as I was reading back through the recommendations yesterday and earlier today, I actually highlighted the comments on cultural, cultural sensitivity comes in not only, it needs to be designed into the curriculum, but then it also needs to be inculcated within teachers and professional development about how they can, when they are delivering the curriculum, how they should be, the cultural responsiveness, the importance of cultural responsiveness in teaching. And then it should be a major part of professional development. I heard Tracy talking and made a note that they've already started on their professional development plan. So clearly, cultural responsiveness, we all know, and especially in a district that's as diverse as Columbus City Schools.
Thank you.
And I want to add, just to add to that, just a reminder that we have a chief of equity position, and that person will begin this in August 1st. And so a lot of that work, to your point, Dr. Pierce, would be under that equity umbrella. So we are aware that those pieces are missing, but we have a strategy for addressing that throughout the entire organization, and it would be through that equity work.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon. I don't know if you know you accidentally turned your camera off. You did it on purpose or not. We'll turn it now over to Board Member Cole.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, everybody, for your topic points and coming to us with these recommendations and ideas. My first is around board controls. I just wanted to have a couple points of clarification. The first is, are we not clearly defining or delineating the board role and other respective roles in tandem with ours? So are we not giving clear enough identification of what our roles are as a board in our bylaws or other policies, and that of our direct reports, the superintendent, the internal auditor, and the treasurer? Are we not doing that well enough? Is my first question.
Well, I think you're leading the legal issues on that, but with regard to curriculum management, the board policies are not detailed enough to communicate your expectation and how the board, and as we talked before, the board or the administration can't hold anyone responsible unless there's clear direction in board policy about what the expectations are. Administrative guidelines are also legally binding, as in the hierarchy, as long as they don't fly in the face of policies, and as long as policies don't fly in the face of statutory and constitutional law. So you meet the letter of the law in terms of, but when it comes to curriculum management, the recommendation is that you need to articulate more specifically, and it's not just in your board policy. It's not just board responsibilities and administrative responsibilities. That's a part of it, but it's more about what the board's expectations are with regard to how curriculum should be managed, including planned, developed, revised, evaluated. We haven't talked much about. So what you've got outlines in generalities. And I think usually what we have found, and I don't want to bird walk on this, but I think your policy is very clear that the board is a governance body and should not cross over into administrative roles. The policy is pretty clear, but it's not unusual for board members and especially new board members that really don't clearly understand oftentimes, and I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but oftentimes board members, when they're running for a position in the board, will promise things, or I'm going to fix that, when in reality, they don't have the authority to fix that. So that's why I think it's a good idea to have that workshop with a facilitator, someone from the OLA or someone, who does board training, to just review, because it's easy to forget it. It's easy to get into the other lane. It's easy, especially if you're passionate about the outcome, which I think all of you are. When you get really passionate about the outcome, you might want to nibble in how you get there. So I think that's just to keep the board in its lane and to keep the administration in its lane, because I said in the recommendation number 1, is there anything that the superintendent is assuming that you think is more board policy, should be more, not policy, but more governance? What authority have you given her that what authority has she assumed that you think should be the board? So that's just a review and reflection and discussion over those 2 different roles. Board Member Cole.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Stripling. You actually went right into what was going to be my second question.
Okay.
Relative to, I see our board as a mixture, this kind of hodgepodge of the 5 different kinds of boards that exist. I see us as a mix of cortex, a mix of consensus, a mix of traditional. You are right. We are very strong with compliance. I certainly agree with that. I concur. With the curriculum management piece, with some of the other things that you mentioned, do you feel as though we are not definitive enough as a board in terms of what our expected outcomes are? Should they be much more definitive in our policy? And I'll use an example. The Carver model that was utilized before I became a board member and done away with the first year I was on the board, which is one of my greatest regrets. I don't regret much ever, but this is the one I do regret. But that model, policy governance, had all of these things very clearly spelled out and delineated in executive limitations, identified with 4 different ends. Is this absent in what we're doing now? And I'm not saying that we need to go back to that, so to speak. What I am saying though is that are you saying that we're weak and that we don't have a definitive enough sense or giving definitive enough direction to the superintendent and our other direct reports that give them a sense of what our ends should be, what our achievables should be, our bottom line is, outside of the mission and the vision?
The answer is yes. I do not think, I think that you are not definitive enough in your policies with regard to curriculum management. If you go, just planning is a great example. You nibble around the edges, as I say, about planning. And I actually went back and I gave you credit. I did the policy analysis, and I actually gave you credit for having a philosophy of planning. So it's clear that you value planning, but it's almost the stepchild in the responsibilities of the superintendent, because it's not just the superintendent's responsibility for planning. So I don't think it's clear enough your expectations of these major components of curriculum management. I don't think your policies and your administrative regs communicate clearly what the board's expectations are in policy and what the administrative direction is with regard to how we're going to implement this policy in curriculum management functions.
Thank you for that. And my final one, until I get another go around, because I certainly want my colleagues to weigh in. What would an example of that be? Give just one example of that. A 90% graduation rate by, What would be an example of that?
Well, you're getting into goals now, you know, and I think those are articulated in your strategic plan. I don't think that needs to be in policy. That could be rolled into your strategic plan in the annual versions of that strategic plan. You know, like if you have we support a strategic or a long range plan. We don't use the term strategic so much, but then you'll have annual iterations of that strategic plan. That's where your goals come out, and that's going to be pretty clearly articulated what your expectations are. But then your policy addresses more of the how you're going to have control over how you get there. You're not going to detail how you get there. That's laid out in administrative regs. But all three of those, there needs to be some alignment between those three. Here, you set your goals, then you make sure your policies have control over those major issues that will help you get to their functions about how you will get to those goals. And then you have administrative guidelines that are going to be the boots on the ground. Then at the end, you evaluate to see if everything is aligned. And did you remember the fourth question is, did it make a difference? Is it there? Is it any good? Is it used? And has it made a difference? So you can apply those questions even to your policies. So if you set policies in place, if you get policies in place and communicate and make sure everybody understands, here's the board's expectations in general, we shall have a curriculum management plan. That's all you need to say in your policy. Then Dr. Dixon picks up on that and she creates that curriculum management plan. That's the first thing we're going to address in recommendation number 2. And then she follows it through. So, and then collectively, now you might say, well, how are we going to determine whether or not that particular initiative had what the outcome was? Well, you're going to have a clear and smooth transition of curriculum development and review. You're going to have a process in place. And then it's going to take you a few years, and I talked about this before, it will take a couple of years before you see much improvement in student achievement. You know, those things don't happen overnight. And hopefully, because of that old belief I used to teach math, that regression to the mean, you know, you're going to see some big improvements probably first, but you don't want those improvements to be so drastic that you're going to drop back the next year. Anyway, I don't want to continue this, but that's how all of you y'all are moving forward with the development of a strategic plan. And I think it's wonderful that you've waited until you've had this audit, until you've got a few other things in place to do that. But then you have to set the wheels in motion to get there. It's not going to happen by magic. You can't just establish those goals and say, okay, now we've got those goals. Kind of like in Texas years and years ago when I was superintendent here in Waco, the legislature enacted law to implement site-based decision-making. Well, we didn't have much time to get it in order, so we just declared we were using site-based decision-making. So you have to put without really planning and defining what it was. So
thank you very kindly. Thank you. Yep.
Thank you. We're going to go to Board Member Beckerle.
Thanks. I just have more of a question or request about the finding that had to do with our organization. I mean, I think clearly having a clear understanding and being able to articulate and demonstrate who answers to who and what the job descriptions are important. But I was also interested in, and I'm kind of wondering if maybe you could provide some insight in organizational structures that other districts of our size that are helpful, in terms of allocating responsibility in such a way so that our superintendent is able to really lead and doesn't have so many direct reports, but also the idea of that's structured in such a way that it facilitates the breaking down of silos, or it prevents the siloing from happening in the first place. And this might be a follow-up thing, but I would just be looking for some insight about that, in addition
Carol,
to.
this district is so big. For example, it's ideal for the principals to report to the superintendent, but that can't happen here. The bigger the district is, the more difficult it is to have this tight little knit group. So, I didn't get a feeling that that you necessarily have silos here. That was not our impression. Again, we weren't on, we were in the district only for 5 days, but even in talking with people, I didn't get the sense that people see themselves in silos. There might, one area comes to mind, and I want to address that on the, in a public forum, but I just, you might want to take a look, all of you, at that total of organization or organizational chart analysis. I think we found that the one of the 6 principles that the organizational chart met was that separation of line and staff. Well, that's really important. I mean, and I have told people I've served as a line in line authority, and I've served in staff positions too, and it's much harder, I think, to do staff. So the audit expectation, the principle of sound organizational management, says you should separate those. So maybe you're thinking those are silos, but silos are really more figurative, I think, than concrete. So I didn't really see the problem with silos, and I don't know with a district your size how you could. We found that the superintendent has a few too many people who report to her also, and we've made some recommendations about how we could reduce that a little bit. Your area superintendents, I think I mentioned this, but they need some help. I'm not recommending that you create new regions. So you've got 6 regions, and they're very naturally developed. But I would recommend, and this might be part of what you're of this issue too, and I don't know that I mentioned this when I was going through said recommendation 1, but take a look at the job description of the area superintendents and see what responsibilities, Dr. Dixon, you might pull from them. And maybe with some, if you end up eliminating a few positions, whether it's through attrition or whatever, you might use those funds to provide support in that area superintendent office to take some of the responsibilities off those superintendents. We all know that the principal is clearly the instructional leader. And that is so important. And as you have new principals come in, I don't recall that y'all have a quick turnover, a short tenure for your principals, but you're going to have principals coming and going. And sometimes even the ones that have been there forever need to be refreshed too. But that area superintendents, and I will tell you, I was pretty impressed with your area superintendents. But their ability to be effective is going to be limited by all these other things that they have to do. So, but anyway, I don't say, Carol, that y'all have, that your silos or anything that are unusual or atypical of a large district, a district such as yours.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. We will go to Board Member Ragland.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you again, Dr. Stribling, for joining us today. I have several questions. My first is based off of Dr. Ocasio's presentation. She gave us quite a bit of information that is all ongoing at the same time. Is it your recommendation that something be created that prioritizes all of those things that she mentioned, and then gave us some semblance of, say, a program management document that talked about how we're going to be implementing all of those things? I mean, that was quite a bit of engaged in there. what would you recommend? Because that was like eating a whole elephant. And I'm thinking that maybe we might be better suited to take some bites and really have some sort of something that we can view that shows us how we've prioritized and what needs to come first, second, third. I hope I'm not really convoluting my question.
Well, I agree that, and as I think I mentioned, I would recommend that but you can't do it. I recommend that at least one, and in some cases it might be, but depending upon the nature of the recommendation, it might be more than one person. But those people identified as responsible, I would say develop a PERT chart. I want to see what you're going to do first, what you're going to do next, what you're going to do third, and then the timeline. These big charts, that's what business does, these big charts on the wall. And it's like evidence for everybody. And then periodically there's a report to the board. First of all, to the superintendent about, and I'm sure she'll be talking about that every week or so, every week or every 2 weeks. Administrative executive team meetings. So yes, because sometimes it is easy to get lost in the forest and to lose focus if you don't back it to planning. But yeah, PERT chart is just an example, but it shows here's what we're going to do and here's the timeline, here's when it's going to be finished. Start on this curriculum management plan. We're going to get that done by the summer, and we're going to get into this in recommendation number 2 in just a minute. So the answer would be yes. I think there's just too much to do. It's easy to get overwhelmed if you don't get things in place and in order.
Stated, I'll be reporting out to the board the progress that we've been making. Sure.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon, and thank you, Ms. Jaquette, for jumping on that. That's going to be a Herculean task, but I'm looking forward to it. My next question is regarding the discussion around the contract with our teachers, and what was said today regarding our inability to renegotiate. My question for Dr. Stribling is really around whether or not you believe, because what you said was that within the current contract, there are opportunities for us to implement every part of recommendations from the actual audit. And that was kind of my interpretation as well. But my question to you very specifically is around whether or not you believe that the district would benefit from specific training for our building level administrators on initial training, but more ongoing training, so that we know precisely and our administrators know precisely what it is they have the authority to do within the scope of the contract, how they should be going about the process of implementation of the guidelines within that contract. Do you think that specific training for our administrators would help us achieve the goal of moving towards academic achievement?
I think that is an excellent idea. I mentioned on a number of occasions we got in the audit, and we didn't put all these quotes from principals and vice principals in the audit, but many principals made comments about how they thought they were moving in the right direction. They were working on what's best for kids, and all of a sudden they were told you can't do that because of the union, because of the agreement. So I think it's just, clearly that communicated to me that a number of principals, a number of your campus leaders aren't familiar with that. And I think it's so important, y'all, that and I see Carolyn's with us and John's with us, that these discussions, it's like assume good intent. Enter into those discussions in a to disagree, which is okay. But I think you make a good point. I really haven't thought about that earlier, but so many principals clearly don't understand what's in the agreement because they had taken action and they were pretty disgusted about it. They were taking action in what they thought was the right thing to do, and then they were told, they found out, well, you can't do that because that flies in the face of the agreement. So yeah, why not get everybody together and just have a discussion, a question answer period. So what's in that contract.
Madam President.
Thank you. I see no more questions on recommendation 1. I do want to remind everyone we have until 8 p.m. this evening. We are in no rush. So, we want to make sure that we do spend the time we need to on this. I don't know if we had talked about going in order, but I don't know if there's one that we think would be more judicious of our time right now, or we can certainly go to recommendation number 2.
Well, I think let's go to 2, Jennifer, because I think that's so important. And I've listened to what Tracy had to say, and y'all have clearly done some of these things already. I will move more quickly through these. I spent more time on 1 because it was the first one, and it's more engaging with the board because it's all about control, and the board has a great responsibility. A lot of recommendation number 2 is administration. But you still, so I will go through this. I won't be as detailed, but yeah, let me take number 2. So now, if you will, let's look at recommendation number 2. And at my hard copy, that's on page 326, pretty much at the top. Recommendation number 2 incorporates basically everything that's in standard 2, the findings that were in standard 2, and there were 3 of them. So we're looking at curriculum management planning, number 1. You decide this is very akin to policy. Here's how we're going to develop, manage, implement, and evaluate curriculum. And then it talks about the scope of curriculum, and then it talks about the quality of curriculum. So very quickly, I'm not going to read that to you, and you see the rationale paragraph there, and then the summary paragraph in the second one. Then we get into the specific recommendations, and it's divided into 3 sections: curriculum management planning, curriculum design, development, and revision, and then curriculum implementation. Really, curriculum implementation, it just punts to recommendation 3 because that's instruction. So let's, at the very bottom of the page, in curriculum management planning, that basically it just says the district needs a curriculum management plan. And what it recommends, 327, is that, Dr. Dixon, this curriculum management plan, now this is not an annual plan, so it doesn't have goals, but it has direction. It's an administrative directive piece. That's why when you get it finished, it needs to have the hallmark of an administrative guideline. So these are guidelines. So again, if you develop a curriculum development policy, as I stated earlier in 1, that's in the 200 series, then your curriculum management plan would be an administrative guideline with the same numbers under that. Now, and then really, if you jump to administrative functions, I'm trying to move on through this, 2.2, it just says the president, once that plan is developed, then it needs to be implemented. And at the very bottom of page 327, it says here are the components that need to be in the curriculum management plan. And I see that Tracy's still on board. Tracy, I heard you say y'all had started on an assessment management plan and a professional development plan, but I didn't hear you comment on a curriculum management plan. Have y'all started that yet? She may have stepped away. But let me say that this
Dr.
is
Stripling, we did develop a not complete curriculum management plan yet, but we did develop a curriculum response or a curriculum adoption cycle to cover those covered
Okay.
areas that you mentioned.
So you might, expand that. And I will say now, typically in the report, we don't recommend training, but I will tell you that PDK and CMISI has a 2 and this would be for Dr. Dixon, has a 2-day session that's outstanding to help. And actually, you don't just learn how to do it, you actually do it. You get started, the participants get started on their curriculum management plan. So you can talk with your contact at PDK. But because that curriculum management plan is the who, what, where, when, why, how, and how much, in some cases, of how this district is going to manage curriculum. And that is outlined on pages 328 and 329, and we go into detail about those characteristics of those elements that need to be in your curriculum management plan. So I'm going to move very quickly. You see all of the, and it talks about, you know, who's supposed, what the responsibilities are, how it's going to be done. And one of the things in there is that it should be in the curriculum management plan is a standard curriculum format. And, you know, we talked about organizational chart format. The more standard formats you can have, to the degree that it doesn't distract from what you're trying to get accomplished, the better, I think, the more user-friendly those documents are going to be. So moving on to page 330 at the very top of the page. So curriculum management plan. You need some direction for deployment, how you're going to get all this work done. Tracy mentioned a few of those, but Tracy, all that needs to be in a single plan that becomes an administrative guideline. Clearly communicated to everybody involved, so everybody understands exactly how you're going to do, who's going to do it, what you're going to do. So at the top of page 330, we talk about curriculum design, development, and revision of existing documents. As y'all recall, some of the documents you have, and I mentioned this yesterday when we were on our telephone conversation, I think the question came up, does this district have a capacity to write quality curriculum documents? And I'm going by what I saw, and to see social studies curriculum documents that receive a perfect score, K through 12, is very rare. I've never seen it before. So I would say that's unique for me. So I do think you have some capacity. It wouldn't hurt, though, you know, to develop quality guides, but it wouldn't hurt, again, so we've got some training. It wouldn't hurt to train other people, because there's a few people can't do this. But the first recommendation under this is that, and I'm looking through here, again, we're talking about policy and just a few of those. 8.4 basically says develop administrative guidelines that say, all of our, here's the format we're going to use for our curriculum documents, all curriculum documents. And you might want to have one for elementary, or maybe elementary and middle, or maybe elementary and then middle goes with high school. You may want to have, depending upon the nature of your framework, as Tracy was referencing. But you see on under 2.4, the components, and these are the 6 components of the social studies curriculum. Got an 18 score of 18, every one of them that you have. You don't have all of them, but that should be order number 1. You need to get started on this. I'm trying to see. I think they said this should be. We haven't talked too much about the timeline. 2 years, and I would say 2 to 3 years. So recommendation number 2 should be accomplished in 2 to 3 years. Writing curriculum and reviewing curriculum and revising curriculum is time consuming, I know. So we're just recommending that you ought to have this in place in 3 years, and then you're going to be training folks. So guideline, here's what our curriculum, not only are we going to be writing it forever, but it's going to be quality, and here are the components that need to be in those curriculum documents. I flipped to 332 now. 27 through 29, and I wrote on the side of this level 1 training. I highly recommend that the district, and Dr. Dixon and I talked about this, that you bring in for the district what we call level 1 curriculum management training. We really get into detail in this training about what backloading, what front-loading the curriculum is, what deep alignment of curriculum. It's a 3-day training. It's much more cost reasonable if you bring the training internally. So you work with PDK on that, but I think a lot of districts who have an audit, that's the number one. In fact, I would say if you don't do any other training beyond just what we're doing with this board training, that you would do level 1 for your curriculum writing folks and for really all the top level folks in academics, as well as some of the folks in accountability. And then you do the curriculum writing training. I'm sorry, you do the curriculum management plan training. That would be a 3-day, level 1's 3-day. That curriculum management plan writing is 2-day. And PDK can take care of that. Curriculum implementation is in the middle of page 332, and as you can see, that's all about teaching, and all they punt here and refer you to recommendation 3, and then recommendation 6, which is professional development, which we discussed in this audit in productivity. So basically, that's a quick and dirty overview. And again, board, that's more administrative in nature. Once you get those policies in place, so you've got control, you're clearly communicating what you expect, and there's detail in here about what those elements are, then it's administrative in nature. So, President Adele,
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we have some questions. And I think that last point's a good reminder. There are five recommendations for the board. And again, most of the recommendations are for Dr. Dixon. So just be mindful. I know that sometimes all of it kind of gets mushed together as we're going through it, but I really want to try to focus on what's board work and what's the superintendent's work, so we can make sure that we are, moving efficiently together. But certainly you may ask questions about any of the recommendations, because Dr. Dixon does want to hear our thoughts. So we will start with Dr. Pierce, and then we will go to board member Ragland.
Thank you so much, President Adair and Dr. Stripley. As I was doing my research, one of the things that I came across was that curriculum development team should review each curriculum document on an annual basis and have an in-depth revision and update for the curriculum on a 6 to 8 year cycle, as determined by your curriculum management plan. This development cycle is a critical piece to managing the work in the curriculum budget. So based upon that research, and as my guiding foundation, these are the 3 questions that I have for you. Do you recommend that our board establish an academic committee once we
I think that's truly administrative, but I do think you need to expect a report. You were breaking up, your voice was breaking up. Your connection might be a little bad at the very beginning, but the 6 to 8 year, certainly a curriculum development review, develop all of it. I think that's critical. First, you need to get curriculum in place for every course taught at every grade level. But then reviewing that, you put it on a cycle, and I think 6 to 8 years is pretty long. I would say more like 4 to 6 years, ideally 4 years. You might want that cycle, though, to align with any state cycles for resources for textbooks. I don't know if y'all have state textbooks. I don't know if Ohio has that, but for example, in Texas, we align our curriculum review when our textbook adoption comes up at the state level. But 6 to 8 seems a little long to me. I would say more like 4 to 6. But and then, of course, you stop, look, and listen. Anytime an external thing happens that you have to review, even though that was off schedule.
So you move to my 3rd question, and that question was, how should we align our curriculum management plan with our budget process?
With your budget process? One of the things we wrote you up on, so to speak, in your budget process is that your budget approval came before your planning Once you get your curriculum management plan in place, and once you clearly whatever cycle that the district, and that's up to y'all, whatever cycle you put into that plan for review and revision that's going to cost the money, then that would need to guide your budget. So you'd need to review those plans before you get into the budget, the final budget approval. And that's not unusual, but we found an exception there that the board, it's like the tail is wagging the dog. The budget is approved before plans are in place, and before you, without the advantage of looking at planning what you need to do, plans and looking at what you need to get accomplished.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Board Member Rad.
Thank you, President Adair and Dr. Stribling. My question is around the development of the curriculum itself and the solicitation of our outside partners in developing that. And I'm thinking specifically of our colleges and universities throughout the state. Has it been your experience? I'm understanding that we've got this huge behemoth of a land grant institution over at Ohio State that may be helpful, even if only on the research component. Would those types of entities be helpful throughout this process? I know that Dr. Pierce has mentioned cultural competency and some of the other things that are overarching concerns for the district. We have two historically Black colleges and universities within the state of Ohio that may be able to take off a piece of some of this as well in partnership with us under this new undertaking. Are there examples from around the country where districts like ours, or even smaller or larger, have used the resources of their land grant institutions and other institutions to do actively for the benefit of students, or is that not recommended?
No, absolutely it's recommended. And I'll tell you what, that's good. That's quality, inexpensive labor and help. And there are examples everywhere, and I would highly recommend. There are assistant professors who are wanting tenure and promotion to associate professor. There are associate professors who need research and articles, and they're willing. Sometimes that's just a part of their service. When I was at Texas A&M University, the Texarkana branch, my husband was superintendent in Texarkana ISD, the Texarkana School District, and I was dean. I served as dean and provost, and so with the two of us together, we made connections, and we, at no charge to the district people in both the business, in this, I think we had faculty from business and faculty from psychology and faculty from education working with the district in these efforts. So clearly, if it's curriculum development, it would be in the education department, but I highly recommend that. You've got knowledgeable people who have an interest and a need to serve the community. So yes, reach out. You've got Dr. Pierce from the Ohio State University, and there are other universities. Reach out to them. You'd be surprised at how eager they're going to. I think you're going to find people eager to help.
Glenn. Okay, looks like there's no questions on this recommendation. All right, so we can move on.
Okay, recommendation 3 addresses standard 3, and we get out of order, as you can see on page 12. It's not just automatically lockstep here, but 3 talks about instruction and monitoring. The focus in 3, recommendation 3, is instruction, delivery of the curriculum, which I told you is the most difficult piece of all, because it involves a lot of independent contractors, which we call teachers, and their interpretation of what needs to be done in the classroom. And we consider the audit level, we consider instruction to be loosely held. And I think we talked about these concepts Like your policies are tightly held. Your curriculum is tightly held. There's no excuse me just a minute. I have a cramp in my leg. There's no negotiation on whether or not people are going to follow your policies. Okay, maybe this will, I think I've been sitting too long. But the delivery instruction with your especially with your instructional framework, and I was so pleased to hear from Tracy that y'all have are moving in that direction, or already have established an instructional framework. Instruction is loosely held, so there are no specific directions about here's how you need to teach Algebra 1 or Biology 1. So in recommendation 3, we talk about teaching though and monitoring. So you will see a little bit of rationale there to start, and this is divided into instructional practices, which would be teaching, that begins on page 3. Starts at the top of 335. So let's review. Well, and let's look at G3.1. Let me see how much time they think it's going to. Usually that's at the very beginning, and it might be at the end. I don't see a timeline on this. Maybe I'll run across it in a minute. The number of years, the length of time it should be you should be expected to accomplish these recommendations. But G3.1 addresses the common instructional framework, and Tracy said that y'all are already working on this, and that's great. That's important. And so again, that is a framework for what the board expects and the administration expects to happen in the classroom when they get there. It's not instructional strategies, but it's the big framework. When I was teaching in public schools, you know, the focus was on mastery learning. Y'all probably never heard of Madeline Hunter, but the mastery learning concept, that would be an instructional framework. We're gonna didactic it, we're gonna plan, we're gonna deliver didactic instruction, we're gonna check for understanding, and we're gonna reteach if we need to. That's an instructional framework. So that's number one, is that in policies, all you need to say in policy, you don't need to outline these details, but that will be, again, this is some recommendation number 1, but the district's instructional framework will be determined as, and then you name it or you describe it. And I think that's enough about. Jennifer wanted just to focus on the governance pieces. I want to be sure I don't. Number 3.2 addresses training of that instructional framework. So again, that's really directing the superintendent. Some of these should be in once you get a policy in place, I would say the superintendent's going to clearly recommend. So 3.2 and 3.3 in governance are basically just instructions to or anticipated. Here's what our expectations are to the superintendent. Looking at the administrative functions, here's what the administration needs to do with regard to recommendation 3. But before I go there, I want to go back just a minute. I think it's important for the board to put, and probably in policy, not only that you expect an instructional framework, but what you believe the general approach to teaching that you expect in your classrooms. And we found elements of rigor, student-centered instruction. Those are general approaches. They're not detailed because there are lots of ways that teachers can provide student-centered instruction. But the board needs, I don't know if you remember or not, but in the finding, there were 2 pages of what we found in documents, policy and other documents about what the expectations were. Well, that's way too many. And there weren't to review documents. So I would suggest that in some sort of workshop at some point in time, y'all have a discussion in general about what the board's expectations are for, there doesn't need, for example, we didn't find much expectation with regard to technology. So, and I'm not saying we don't, I mean, I think a lesson, but we know that it's engaging for students. I guess where I'm going with this is, is that part of what you anticipate? Is that part of your direction, your belief that the use of technology should be incorporated into teaching, or that it should be student centered, and you should be teaching at high levels of rigor? Those are general expectations about teaching. They're not teaching strategies, but they're general expectations about the kinds of teaching strategies that should be seen, that teachers should be using when they go into the classroom. And then, of course, obviously, the administration needs to be sure that professional development is provided for that. So I just wanted to throw that in before I went any further. On 3.2, A3.2, at the top of page 334, that list under 3.2, there's an introductory comment there about the Common Instructional Framework. And that list from A to M is just a list of effective teaching practices that might be incorporated for a teacher. Moving on here, I feel like we're under a little bit of pressure since we've taken a lot of time. On page 335, let's move on into instructional monitoring. So instruction is, get the board's expectations for the common instructional framework, general direction about what everybody's going to focus on, do you want your students to be taught at high levels of rigor? Because what we found, you said we saw some vestiges of that expectation, and what we found was that teaching was not generally at high levels of rigor. The district does not have, I did a word search on your policy and found no policy, not even any reference to instructional monitoring in your policy. And what we found is that instructional monitoring is happening in your district, but all principals are doing their own thing. So because of that, it's fragmented and there's lack of continuity. So what we're recommending in this particular section is that the district, and this is 3.4, the first item under monitoring, is that the superintendent help the board to develop a policy. And I don't know that I think you could probably put this monitoring piece in your overall curriculum policy, but there needs to be direction from the board regarding your expectations for monitoring instruction, because we know how important that is. 3.5 through 3.10 actually should be moving as directing the superintendent. You say direct the superintendent. All that information should be incorporated into administrative regs. And I think, Talisa, I would say develop a monitoring, put somebody in charge of developing a plan for monitoring that's going to include who's going to be responsible for monitoring. First of all, how are we going to define monitoring in this district? What's the purpose of monitoring? Who's going to be doing it? How they're going to do it? We found numerous different monitoring documents, because some folks even said they use the district monitoring documents when the district doesn't even have a standard monitoring document. So again, the who, what, where, when, why, and how of monitoring instruction. That's critical to that plan, do, study, act, that continuous improvement. Well, and those issues, the who, what, where, when, and how, all of that's on through D. So again, you'd want a policy just saying we're going to have instructional monitoring is important, send the communication, the direction to folks, and then the superintendent would create the details in an administrative guideline. 3.6 addresses the instructional walkthrough. Again, that it wouldn't hurt once you get your monitoring plan in place for you to train, especially your principals and anybody else who has a primary responsibility for monitoring. PDK offers, or it works with others to offer a walkthrough training for principals. I don't know if you've done any of that, but if you haven't, you might consider training for people. You can't just say we're going to do it. That's important for the board to understand, because superintendent I know understands it. You can't just declare, because that won't happen. You've got to train, you've got to make sure they understand what the meaning is, and then you've got to train them to do it. 3.7 addresses those artifacts. Remember we talked about artifacts, and what we found in our artifacts is that they were mostly on content. They were mostly on grade level, except for the reading language arts, I think, was below, kind of all the way down the grade levels, especially at elementary. But they were very low cognitive levels, and we're recommending here that you develop artifacts to be used in your curriculum documents, but then you also set up a system for monitoring and routinely. And Lisa, this might be something you want to get, not the principals, but maybe the curriculum folks, just to routinely pick up artifacts out of classrooms and check to see, and we go through the process in the findings, so you can see how there's a chart in there. You can see exactly how we check those artifacts to see if they were aligned in cognitive rigor, in content, and in context, which is how the student, what the student is doing, the work that they're doing. So 3.7 will give you guidance, give the administration guidance about how to ensure that those artifacts, that student work is aligned, tightly aligned to that written curriculum. 3.9 on the next page just says that, you know, I'm trying to remember now, it's been a while since we wrote this, but I think the only principal maybe the only principal job descriptions we found were actually vacancy notices. But be sure you incorporate in those job descriptions and that for the positions that you expect to be monitoring the curriculum, be sure you put that in the job descriptions. And 3.11 talks about professional development. For monitoring the curriculum, and that's where you might want to consider training for your principals that make the 3-minute walkthrough. So that's a quick overview of 3, which again is primarily administrative, but it's where the rubber, it's really the first part of 3. We haven't got, later on we're going to cover the equity and equality, and that's in recommendation number 5, equity, equality, and ESL programs. So Madam President, let me bump this back to you for questions or comments from the board.
Yes, so Dr. Pierce has a question.
Madam President, I can hold until she goes through the next recommendation.
Okay. There appears to be no questions, so Dr. Pierce will hold her question until recommendation 4.
Okay, so let's move to recommendation 4, which covers standard 4, which, as you may recall, is all about assessment and the use of assessment data as feedback for improvement, that continuous improvement loop. And that's important. It's just not assessment. For assessment's sake is too expensive to just say, okay, so what? Now you've got to, how can you use those data for improvement? So you'll look through there. There's quite a bit of intro on that, but basically just says what we found was that you do not have an assessment plan, which is important. And my recommendation is, and I think Tracy's still connected to us, that you get assessment folks, and in your curriculum management plan, you incorporate the elements of curriculum assessment plan, because if you look at both of those sets of criteria side by side, a lot of them are the same. And it will be more meaningful to people if you incorporate teaching and assessment, the written curriculum and the assessed curriculum in the same document. So that's my recommendation. It's not necessarily the audit's recommendation, but that's my recommendation. If you want to have two documents, you can. So number one, the first recommendation is that you get that assessment plan in place. The who, what, when, where, how of assessment. Number two is that you get assessments, district developed, but teachers can develop them, but they need to be district held, tightly held assessments for every course taught at every grade level. That is a daunting task. Of all the things to be done, that may be the most daunting one. And that specific recommendation is kind of hidden here. That's in 4.1, that's A 4.7, several pages over. And I'm still at kind of the summary, the overview. And then in order, get your curriculum, get your assessment management plan in place, develop assessments for all courses taught at all grade levels, and then develop a system or a plan, institutionalize that system for how data are going to be used. It was clear that everybody we talked with understood the importance of data, of the use of data, but there's no system in place to communicate to people. There's been many teachers said that they needed training on how to use data. So that piece is, so all three of those pieces are addressed here. And let me see if I can. So now those were kind of general comments. Look at the top of page 3.3.9 under governance functions. Direct the superintendent to present the board for review and adoption a new or revised policy. And here's what I suggest. You have policy 2623 is student assessment and academic interventions. So that's the policy I think you don't need a new policy, but revise that policy. But basically that's where you say, here's where this district expects a curriculum, a comprehensive student assessment plan. And the elements in that plan are addressed 1 through 6. That should be in policy, but then the plan elements begin on page 340 under 4.4. There are 16 elements, and some of these align very closely with the elements of curriculum management plan. That's why I think you have one plan. So back to the silo business that Carol was talking about, you have these curriculum and these assessment folks working together with a single plan. So under governance functions, I'm looking here, most of this is, again, commit adequate resources for that, because developing assessments is going to be an expense to the budget. This again is an excellent way, though, for you to use Board Member Ragland, the universities, because people may think developing a test is easy, but developing an internally valid test, developing a test with internal validity and reliability is very hard. So get those university folks to come in and help you do that. But teachers are going to need to be involved. Of course, these assessments must be aligned to your written curriculum. But you'll see the details here. Most of this is administration. You'll see the details here about what needs to be in the policy is under G41. What needs to be in the assessment plan is in 4.4. And then 4.7, I've just mentioned, is the scope issue, get assessment documents, and this is going to take you a while to do. And I think where you'd want to start where your areas of greatest weakness of achievement are. You've got to start somewhere, and it may not be at kindergarten. It may be look to see where your students are performing the lowest are not meeting your expectations, and start there. Then 4.8 through and 4.9 address the use of data. So get in place some directive, some direction, some guidance for how the use of data is going to be accomplished in this district. Four 4.10 really addresses trend analysis, and I think I mentioned it, but get your accountability office. You've got an amazingly staffed accountability department, and it needs to be running trend analysis on every which way from go. The board and the superintendent collectively, and I believe in collaboration. And I realize the board's governance, but as a superintendent, I wanted to know up front the board's thoughts on some things. So discuss, decide what variables, what outcomes, what student assessment pieces you want to monitor on a regular basis, and direct the accountability office to run those trend analysis for you. They've got the horses in the stable. They just need some direction for what you expect. So these recommendations, and the trend, back to 410, it just says, certainly you want to do trend analysis on the gap, closing the gap of your different subgroups. Recommendations should be accomplished from between 6 to, I would say, 3 years. I don't think you can get assessments completed in 2 years, but I'd push that out maybe, but not institutionalized. So that's recommendation number 4. Dr. Dixon, was there anything I didn't point out or highlight that you think I should?
No, I think you captured it well. I think we have to keep emphasizing to our audience that this work won't happen overnight.
Yes.
And I think that's important. I'm looking at my board members. I just want them to know that, although we know, and I too have a sense of urgency, the work takes time, and usually it happens, always happens with teacher teams. We have some very smart teachers in this district, and those teacher teams, along with our administrators, they're going to be very thoughtful about this work. And again, it goes back to what has to happen first. It goes back to recommendation number 1. And as we work with recommendation number 1 on those board policies, and then we address those administrative regs. So some of this work is going to be happening simultaneously, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, but I just want everyone to know that, we're talking about 3 to 4 years worth of very intentional work that has to be done, and that we do, and we would do well.
And the important thing, I want to go back to what Board Member Ragland said. It's critical that whoever's in charge of these, and Mike, I'm kind of bringing you in this conversation, that you discuss with the folks who are going to be leading the packs, that they're going to be overwhelmed. And thank you, Dr. Dixon, for saying that. If you don't outline this, here's what we're going to do first, and here's the timeline which we're going to get this accomplished. Yeah. It doesn't mean that you're going to do only one thing at a time, even with these recommendations. But here's how we're going to do our work. If you don't do that, people are going to get overwhelmed. And you know what happens when we get overwhelmed? We have a tendency just to sit down and suck our thumb, and not do anything. So I think it's important that you do continue to stress, guys, this is going to take time. And let's just think this through. What do we need to do first? What do we need to do second? And get this work done.
Thank you. You ready for questions? Okay. We'll go to Dr. Pierce. And Board Member Ragland, will you please mute your mic if you aren't going to talk? Thank you.
So as I lead into my question, I want to clarify, when I use the term silo, that referred to the lack of cooperation, communication, joint planning by the board, administration, and the community. We have received this audit, and it is leading us into a great direction of how we need to implement and develop policy, how our administration needs to develop guidelines and processes to ensure that our students are learning. But we can't do that without the community. We can't do that without parent buy-in. We can't do that without caregivers knowing what our expectations are. So I just want to very clearly state that when I talk about silos, I'm talking about all parts coming together with students at the center and focus, and us not continuing to operate how we've operated in the past by saying, send us your children, we'll educate them. No, we do it jointly, collectively with parents and caregivers and community helping us. And so that's very key and important, because we can start to implement all of this stuff. But if we don't have buy-in, if we don't have community support, if auntie and the barber and grandma and grandpa and mom and dad don't know what the expectations are, we're going to fall short. So I just want to clarify that that's what I meant by our silo operations that we've had. Now, my question specifically—
Dr. Pierce, can I echo something that you stated and just remind everyone of our portrait of the graduate process? And then maybe that's where you're going to lead to next. So as we were thinking about this audit and anticipating this, we were having those community conversations. And so there's going to be, we just completed session 3. We have another opportunity that I think board members can help facilitate, and that's like taking the message out to the community, confirming that if we've captured our hopes and dreams and aspirations for our students, and how we actualize this in our curriculum moving forward. So you're absolutely on it, and I thank you for lifting that point. But we are setting the table per se for more involvement of our community stakeholders, our parents, and our students. We already have that design team of over 150 stakeholders who are already involved with this work. So thank you for that clarification, and thank you for making sure that we are keeping all our stakeholders in front and with us as we go through this work.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon, for that. I don't know if you heard, but our youngest clapped when you said that. So Michelle, our little 5th grader from Clinton, was over here clapping as you were saying that. So you have a fan in the house. So my question for Dr. Stripling is, the challenge for our board is creating policy as we come out of this. Do you recommend that we undertake this work in our existing policy review committee, or that we establish a task force to create these policies and then send them through PRC and to the board for adoption?
Dr. Pierce, I don't know why you couldn't use your existing structure to do that. So, you know, I'm all about trying to operate when you can.
Did something happen?
I think I'm trying to get back in.
You're here.
Okay, mouse dropped off the edge and I lost you. I think there's no reason why you couldn't operate within your existing board structure. If
I just asked that question for timeliness.
Yeah.
Sometimes we can be a little slow coming out of that committee, so that's why.
They'll just change the way the committee operates then, you know, just rather than reestablishing or reinventing it. I certainly see no reason why you couldn't keep it in structure in line.
Excellent, thank you.
Are there additional questions on recommendation 4? Okay, seeing none, and the fact that we are nearing the 8 o'clock hour, we've been at this for a while. We are going to stop here, and we will arrange a time to pick it back up or figure out a different way to talk about it, whatever we find is most beneficial. But we certainly thank you, Dr. Stripling, for spending this 2.5 hours with us this evening and walking us through and helping us identify what it is. It's the board's role in lifting pieces of this up. We do have a lot of work to do, and I think we're all very excited to do that work. We're very excited to do that work with our partners who are here and listening, with our community, with our families, and conjunction with the other pieces that we're doing, like Portrait of a Graduate and strategic planning. It's all those pieces that will holistically move this district forward, which I believe is at the center of every single board member's mind, and our question zero of ensuring our children have the best education possible. Are there any last minute questions or comments? I see that board member Beckerly has something she'd like to add. No, never mind. She was saying she was having a tech issue. All right. Are there any last minute comments? Okay, well, seeing none, then I will ask for a motion to adjourn this meeting.
I motion that we adjourn our board retreat meeting this evening.
Second.
Mr. Treasurer, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Cole,
Yes.
Dr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Ragland,
Yes.
President Adair,
Yes.
Ms. Beckerly,
Yes.
Mr. Brown.
Yes.
That motion carries.
Thank you all, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Good night, all. Thank you, staff.